computer? Okay. There we go. Hello and welcome to the Smithville, Texas Eco Photo Festival 2021 webinar series. I'm Jill Strube, the past chair of the Smithville Area Chamber of Commerce and one of the founders of the EcoFest back when it was the Smithville Green Expo. Both the Texas Photo Festival and the EcoFest have been a tradition in Smithville for over 10 years. We are continuing to make the connections between eco and photo, and this is our second year using a virtual format for these interesting and important presentations. Our gratitude goes to you, the viewer, and your interest in these topics. This year, the theme is habitat, and we've asked experts in the ecological world and the world of photography to help us dive deeper into the habitats all around us. Today's presenter is Jeff Parker, and I'm very glad to say he can do both of those things. Jeff is equal parts pro photographer and naturalist. He was captivated by nature's big screen long before he developed a passion for capturing with the camera. Jeff enjoys encouraging others to photograph and marvel over nature's wonders. He believes nature photography has the power to bring deeper awareness to the issues of conservation. Such images make people care more, he says. That's exactly why we started this Eco Photo Fest program. So this is great, Jeff. I really appreciate it. His work has appeared in many magazines, including Audubon, American Profile, Outdoor Photographer, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Texas Wildlife, and Texas Journey, as well as books, Borderlands of Laredo, Texas and Wildlife in Focus. With his wife, writer Mary O. Parker, he published the award-winning nature travel guide, Explore Texas. Jeff leads photo tours throughout the Western US, Europe, and South and Central America. He and Mary O. also hold one-day workshops at their Central Texas Nature Preserve, Red Valley Ranch. And he has a really terrific website, which will be included as a resource. You can find that at exploreinfocus, all one word, .com, exploreinfocus.com. And they've come out to the Smithville Public Library a couple of times to showcase their books. I have to say, I think I have the Wildlife in Focus myself. So Jeff, we are really glad that you are able to join us today. Thank you for being here, and thanks for all your work out in the field. And I'm really looking forward to seeing this presentation. I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right, Jill, thank you so much for having me. Let me get the presentation going here. All right, now we're up and running. So I'm going to talk mostly about the bird photography side. That does encompass habitat, as I'm going to be talking about backyard bird photography, things you can do right wherever you live. I am fortunate to be able to travel extensively and go to many exotic locations, but there's fantastic things you can do right in your own yard. So that brings us to why backyard bird photography. Like I said, it's easily accessible. You've got it available year round. You can try new things. You know, you're pretty much, for the most part, except for during migration, you're going to have the same birds, you know, in your yard most of the time. So if you try something that doesn't work out, it's no big deal. You can take better photos tomorrow. So it's the best way to learn new equipment, new techniques, and experiment, try different things. So in this presentation, I'm going to go through a few different things. First, we're going to start out talking about equipment for bird photography. Then I'm going to switch to more talking about the birds themselves, learning about them, how to attract them, friendly habitat in your yard. And then at the end, we'll wrap up again, talking more about photography with camera settings, setups, which is what I really enjoy about backyard bird photography, and then taking the shot, putting it all together. So to begin with, to do bird photography, of course, you have to have a camera. There are phenomenal little, I call them point and shoot, but they're all-in-one cameras with a built-in lens that can do a pretty good job. But to really get good results, you really need what's called a DSLR, a digital single lens reflex, or one of the newer mirrorless cameras that are very similar, where you can interchange the lenses. The lens is crucial, and having a long, good quality lens is really going to be your best bet to get good results. When looking at a camera, if you're looking to buy something that you don't already own, autofocus performance is really key. I just recently switched to a new camera, the Canon R5, and the autofocus is amazing, much better than anything I've ever used in the past. Other things to think about are frame rate. That's how many frames per second the camera can take. That's not super important, but you don't want something really slow because you might miss that action if the bird's doing something. Another thing to think about is how the camera responds to high ISO. If you don't know what that is, it's a little bit more on the technical side, but basically you can turn up the amplification of the light. And some of the older cameras, especially Canon, unfortunately, which I've shot all along, don't do very well at high ISOs. The newer ones do much better. Sony does really well. And then crop factor, whether you use full frame or a crop factor camera, it's kind of up to you. Crop factor gives you the effective length of your lens is longer because it's cropping into part of the image. But typically they're cheaper. Lenses is really one you want to spend your money though. The camera is not nearly as important as the lens is. With bird photography in particular, size really does matter. The longer the lens, the better. 400 millimeters is about the minimum. The longer the lens you can get, the better off you're going to be. They make some pretty good zoom lenses now. Sigma and Tamron are both making a 150 to 600 millimeter zoom lens that is much less expensive than the old offerings from Canon and Nikon and Sony, 600 millimeter primes. So that's a good way to go. And again, spend your money on the lens. Cameras change, kind of like computers. You know, every 18 months to 2 years, there's new cameras coming out. The old ones get outdated. People move up. You can buy their old stuff whenever they move up. You can buy it used and go that route. But the lenses tend to stick around a lot longer. A good lens will easily last you 10, 12, 15 years. So it's worth the investment. And this is just a demonstration of how the different lenses can magnify your subject. I took these 3 shots in my backyard, didn't change the camera position whatsoever, just changed the lenses. And you can see with, you just imagine there was a hummingbird there on this feeder. With a 400 millimeter lens, it's going to be pretty small in the frame at this distance. With a 600 millimeter, it's going to be pretty good. It'll look pretty decent. And then on my 600 millimeter, I added what's called a teleconverter, which is just a supplementary lens that goes on the back of your lens, between your lens and your camera. And that acts like a magnifying glass. So it's 1.4 times whatever your focal length is. So you can see with that at 840 millimeters, a hummingbird there would fill up pretty much the whole frame. So that's just a graphic showing how the size of your lens, the length of your main lens, really affects the magnification of your subject. So teleconverters, which I just demonstrated there with that 1.4 teleconverter, that's a way to get more length. Say all you have is a 400 or even a 300 millimeter lens. You can add a teleconverter to it. A 1.4 teleconverter added onto a 300 millimeter lens will give it the equivalent of a 420 millimeter lens. A 2x teleconverter will make it the equivalent of a 600 millimeter lens. It'll take your current focal length and double it. So it's a lot less expensive than buying a 600 millimeter lens. It's also a lot less weight, but there are trade-offs. Everything in photography has a trade-off. You can never get something for nothing. The biggest on this is the loss of light. So if you put a 2x teleconverter on a lens, you're going to lose 2 stops of light. That means your shutter speed is going to be dramatically slower. For a given light condition, say you had 500th of a second, and you put a 2x teleconverter on there, you're going to drop 2 stops. The first stop would drop it in half, 250. Second drop, 1/125th. That's a pretty big difference in your shutter speeds. You're going to need a lot more light, or you're going to have to raise your ISO to compensate for them. Depending on the camera that you're using, the autofocus may not work, or if it does work, it might be slow. Now, some of the higher end cameras are not as affected by that, but it just depends on the camera body you're using. And then you can also have a little bit of loss of image quality, especially with the 2x teleconverters. They're typically not quite as sharp as the bare lens. With the 1.4, you don't really notice much of a degradation in quality. To hold up these big lenses, you really need a tripod. You can shoot handheld if you want, especially if you're using a lighter 400 millimeter or maybe one of the zoom lenses that's not too heavy. But if you're using a big 600 millimeter lens or one of the heavier, 400 2.8 or something like that, you're really going to need a tripod for fatigue, if nothing else. And a carbon tripod is really the way to go. It's pretty much what all of them are these days. You can still get an aluminum one if you look around, but they're going to be heavier. They're going to conduct heat and cold and vibration, whereas the carbon fiber will not do those things. It dampens vibration. It doesn't conduct the heat and cold. A lot lighter. Of course, it's more expensive, but again, there's that trade-off. And a gimbal head. So a gimbal head, if you're not familiar with it, it just has an arm and it swings back and forth and side to side, and it effectively makes your big lens weightless. You can let go of it; it'll stay in place. Whereas if you're using a ball head, which is what we use for landscape photography, and you let go of it, if everything's not locked down, it's going to flop to the side, and the whole tripod, everything could fall over. So ball heads are not recommended for wildlife and bird photography. So less expensive ways to get into bird photography, which unfortunately is probably the most expensive genre of nature photography because of the lenses. Use an older camera. Don't worry about megapixels just because the latest camera's got 45 megapixels or 60 megapixels. You know what? The cameras we were using 10 years ago with 12 megapixels still have wonderful images. They publish just fine. There's no reason to worry about the latest and greatest high megapixel camera. Spend money on the lenses, but also look into used. Again, you don't have to have a brand new lens. A lens that came out in 2005, that's what, 15, 16 years ago now, most likely is going to be just still excellent, sharp, and you can get it for half or less of the price that it came out new. So those are just some ways to lessen the cost of getting into bird photography. So now let's talk a little bit about the birds. As a photographer, a wildlife and nature photographer, the more you know about your subject, the better your chances are of getting the shots that you want and really good engaging shots. So you really want to know your birds well to be a good bird photographer. One of the things that we do here at our place, and I encourage everyone to do, is to keep a journal. Anything unusual that happens, write it down, put the date, maybe the weather conditions. Take note of when the migrants arrive in the spring, when you stop seeing them in the fall, or maybe when new migrants arrive in the fall. Keep a note of when nesting occurs. Maybe you've got a large influx of a particular species. Just keep note of those different things, and you can refer back and realize that, hey, it's late August. The hummingbird migration should be here any time now. We need to make sure we've got our feeders ready and stock up on sugar if we need to, and things like that. You can be prepared for what's coming up. Think about wintering location here in Central Texas. We get American goldfinch, and at my house in particular, we get pine siskins as well. We don't see those any other time of year. They're only here in the winter. So think about what birds you might see in the winter versus the summer, or that might be moving through on the way to wintering grounds further south. And then if you have a particular bird that does not winter where you live, think about where do they winter and when might you be able to see them. Spring behavior, spring in Texas is really special with all of our wildflowers, and then bird migration. It's really an exciting time to be a naturalist here in Central Texas. We get a lot of interesting things here in Smithville. We're a little bit too far inland to get all the really great coastal migration, but we do get some things that stray occasionally off course and show up here that we might not ordinarily see. But then there's the ones that we do see every year, and you can start thinking about, when are you going to see your first painted bunting of the year? When will you see the first, what do we have in Mississippi kites? Mississippi kites are always in Smithville. So think about that spring migration, when they're going to show up. What are they going to do when they get here? Are they just passing through? Or are they going to set up territory and breed here for the summer? So that brings us to migration. You got both spring and fall. And typically you'll see some of the same birds, but also you'll see some different birds. Some birds will migrate north in one direction and back south in the fall in another direction. So you might have different species in the spring versus the fall. If there's a particular bird you're interested in, figure out what its migration pattern is, when it might show up, and where. Is your backyard on their migration route? Breeding, so we've got our summertime birds that breed here. A particular favorite here at my place is the painted bunting. They show up in mid to late April. They set up territories, breed, raise their young, and then once the young are ready to fledge and start to live on their own, they'll leave here in mid-August and head back south for the rest of the year. So think about what birds might possibly be breeding in your yard. What kind of behavior can you expect to see? With some birds, you can see some cool courtship behavior. Ruby-throated hummingbirds, well, it's hard to photograph, but it's fun to watch. They'll do a really interesting U-shaped display. Think about, can you do anything to provide them with a nest location, a nest box, construction materials, things like that. One really good way in Texas to attract birds and other wildlife, if you live out of the city to your property, is water. We've been very fortunate this year. It's been a nice wet summer, but typically our summers are hot and very dry. So any water that you have is going to attract birds and wildlife. Two main ways to do that are either standing water or moving water. With standing water, it can be a simple bird bath. Be aware that a lot of the bird baths that are sold, like in Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, are a little too deep and maybe too slick to really do birds much good. You need it to be pretty shallow and a bottom they can get a grip on. If you do have a bird bath that's too deep, one of the things we do is we'll take a big flat rock and place in it just to shallow it up and give them a place to stand and be able to access the water. Another way to provide standing water is a backyard pond or pool. If you're doing a bird bath, it doesn't need to be fancy. The birds don't care what it looks like. If you want to try to photograph the birds on there, bathing or drinking, a dark color is going to be preferable. You don't really want a bright white concrete showing up in your background of your images, but a solid dark color that's not fancy will work just fine for the birds and to photograph from. If you're going to do a backyard pond, make sure at least one end is very shallow. Birds only need about an inch of water to really get in there and splash around, have a bath, have a good time, and to get a drink. You can make it shallow all the way around. I usually like to do it on one end so I know that's where the birds are going to be, and I can set my photography location up on the other side and be able to get photos of the birds and know where they're going to be when they're bathing and drinking. And this was just a very simple garden hose, flooded a little puddle in the yard, got a painted bunting bathing in it with a nice reflection on top. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. You want to keep it clean. You don't want your standing water to get all nasty with mosquitoes breeding in it and things like that. So occasionally you're going to want to drain it, clean it out, and then refill it. Moving water, you can either do a simple drip or a sprinkler or mist system, something of that nature. Birds often really enjoy moving water. If you're using a drip, this is really good in the migration. So the birds that live in your yard year round, they're going to know where any water is. They're going to already be aware of it. They'll come to it. Birds that are just passing through on migration may not know that you have water in your yard, but if you've got a drip that's making noise, they'll hear that water drop and that'll bring them in. So make sure that it does make a sound. Rocks with natural depressions are really great. You can give you a nice small area for the birds to bathe in. And it can be as simple as just draping a garden hose over a limb and turning it on real low, or you can go more elaborate. Sprinklers also will bring the birds in. This painted bunting I photographed in my backyard one summer when it was really hot. I had the sprinkler going. I looked outside and there were all kinds of birds playing in the sprinkler. We had hummingbirds, we had chickadees, titmouse, and then the painted buntings. And that often attracts butterflies too. They'll come and do what's called puddling. If you have the sprinkler going and it makes a little puddle and you have some mud there, that'll also attract butterflies to come in and partake of your water. So most people are familiar with bird feeding. There's different types of feeders and different types of food will attract different species. So some of the things that you can use to bring birds into your yard: peanuts. That's typically going to be like blue jays, woodpeckers, titmouse. Black oil sunflower seeds. If you're going to put out one food, black oil sunflower seeds are the king of bird feeds. Pretty much everything eats them. They're easily to find, and pretty much all the birds are going to like it. Thistle seed. I used to put out thistle seed for our American goldfinch in the wintertime. but they were eating the black oil sunflower seeds as much or more. And the black oil sunflower seed is a lot easier to deal with than the thistle feeders. Thistle feeders are usually like socks, and they get torn and they fall apart. So I don't even feed thistle anymore. I just straight do black oil sunflower. Suet, especially in the wintertime, can be really important. It's got that fat that the birds need. When we had our big freeze this past winter, the suet and the sunflower seeds were going crazy here at my house. We went through 2 40-pound bags of black oil sunflower seeds in about 10 days. We had hundreds of birds. So they really depended on that to get them through the cold. Mealworms, if you're squeamish, you may not want to fool with live fresh mealworms. And you can get birds trained to eat dry mealworms, although I've had a little bit of trouble getting my birds to accept that. But once they get onto it, they will come and eat dry mealworms. So this is good for things like bluebirds and wrens, things that don't eat seeds. You can provide them with mealworms. Corn, there are birds that do eat corn, but I don't really recommend it for the backyard. Most of the things that eat corn, about the only thing you're really going to want is cardinals. Everything else would be like, house finches and doves and things like that that you typically aren't going to want in a backyard. Same with mixed seed. I mean, most of the seed mixes that you buy, like in the grocery store, they're full of fillers. Red millet is a big filler. Most of the birds don't eat it. The few that do are birds that you typically don't want in your backyard. So it's kind of a waste of money. The birds are going to kick it out and they're going to head for the black oil sunflower seeds that are in that mixed seed mix. So just buy the sunflower seeds straight. You don't have the extra filler and mess of all the stuff they're kicking out. Millet. So for me here where I live, we get the painted buntings. If you live somewhere further north, you might have indigo buntings, and they really like the white millet. The red millet, nothing eats pretty much except for doves and house finches, or not house finches, rather, house sparrows. But the white millet, the buntings really like. You probably have to special order it. I get it from Smith Supply right here in Smithville, but they don't carry it. I always have to ask for it, and they'll get me a bag, and it takes a day or two to get in. But one bag will last me the whole summer. So. And then lastly, I make a homemade peanut butter / cornmeal mix. Kind of use that like suet, and you can, smear this on tree trunks or whatever. Make the birds go wherever you want, and just like suet, that gives it that fat to help them get through the cold months when we do get cold months here. So probably the best thing you can do as far as habitat and food for your birds is to plant native plants. The birds that live here have evolved with the plants that live here naturally. If you have a lawn that's just, St. Augustine grass and ligustrum and crepe myrtles and, Bradford pear, none of that is native, and none of it provides any habitat for our native birds and insects. And insects are really important. If your plants are not being eaten by insects, they're not part of the ecosystem. All of our birds, even cardinals and things like that eat seeds, use insects for their nestlings. They've got to have insects to feed their babies. So if you have things that bugs don't eat, or you're putting out pesticides, there's no food left for the birds, and you're not going to have butterflies either. Some of the native plants that we can use here are actually most places in the U.S., but here in Central Texas, black-eyed Susans are good for seeds. Pretty much any of your annual flowers, but sunflowers in particular, the birds really like. Painted buntings, when they're not eating my white millet, they like native grass seed. You have to let them grass get tall enough and go to seed. I realize you may not want your front yard to be all tall grass with seed heads on it, but hopefully you can have one area that you set aside for a native meadow that you maybe mainly mow like once a year, where you can have native grasses and wildflowers. Tubular shaped flowers, coral honeysuckle is really good. And another benefit of using native plants, they're not going to be affected by our weather. I saw a lot of people after the big freeze we had in February talking about the plants they lost. You know what? It didn't bother native plants one bit. That cold is actually something we used to have on a fairly regular basis. And the plants that are evolved to live here were not bothered by it whatsoever. My coral honeysuckle bloomed like crazy within 4 weeks after the freeze. Actually, the most blooms I've ever seen on it, and the hummingbirds loved it when they started to show up in the spring. Another tubular shaped flower, you don't want to plant it too close to the house because it can get kind of out of control, is trumpet vine. Wonderful for hummingbirds and bees and things like that, but it does get a little bit out of control if you've got it too close to a house. It's hard to keep it cut back. If all you have is shade, you don't really have room to put things like that. Turk's cap is a great hummingbird and butterfly flower that'll grow in the shade. Small trees that have fruits like crabapple, which doesn't really apply here. Dogwoods, we're right on the edge. You can grow dogwoods here if you give it enough water in Central Texas. Viburnums, native mulberries, not the fruitless mulberries, because if they don't have fruit, there's no berries for the birds to eat. Junipers, every year we'll get a big flock of cedar waxwings come through here and clean our junipers and our yaupons out, and then they'll move on. Going back to small fruiting shrubs, I just remembered a really good one for here is American beautyberry. It does lose its leaves in the wintertime, so it'll be bare, but for 9 months out of the year, it has fresh green foliage. And then this time of the year, it's got beautiful purple berries that the birds like. Pines and spruce, here in Central Texas, where we live in Smithville, we've got the lost pines, as well as what they call cedar trees, which are mostly junipers. They provide really good cover, especially when the weather's nasty, as well as seeds and nesting sites. And then thistles, goldfinch in particular, like thistle seeds, and many birds use the down from the thistles in their nest. In addition to providing habitat for your birds and butterflies and other things, native plants also give us appropriate props for our photography. So this picture with this black-chinned hummingbird, that's a coral honeysuckle, a native vine to this area. And it's one that the hummingbirds really do drink from. So when you're using it for your setup, it's all appropriate. It's not like somebody's putting up a picture of a tulip or something that hummingbirds don't actually feed out of, but you see those kind of pictures from time to time, and you know that that's not an actual, shot taken in nature, that somebody probably filled that with sugar water and they're drinking out of it. But it'll enhance your image. It'll make it scientifically correct to have native plants with the native birds, and provide some added interest to your shot. Snags are really important. I realize if you're living in town, you may not be able to leave standing dead trees, but even if it's only 6 feet tall, it's going to provide crucial habitat for our birds and insects. I used to live in town in Bastrop, and I had a pine tree that died, and it was a huge pine tree, and if it fell, it was going to cause damage to either my house or the neighbors. So I had a tree service come out, and I told them to cut it off at about 10 feet. And they looked at me like I was crazy. They're like, well, sir, it's dead all the way down. I was like, I realize that, but they cut it off at 10 feet. So if it did fall over, it wasn't going to hit anything. Worked out perfectly. The red-bellied woodpeckers came and made a nest in it. Chickadees and titmouse used that nest hole in the following years. I planted a trumpet vine at the base of the snag, and it grew up the side, provided habitat for the hummingbirds. Standing dead trees are just super important. The woodpeckers and things will forage for beetles and larvae in the dead wood, as well as making their homes in it. Nesting boxes. If you don't have standing dead trees with natural cavities, you can put up a nest box, and many birds will take advantage of that. This bluebird house shot is right in my front yard. I've got some bluebird houses that I bought. This one that I knocked together out of some spare wood is actually the one they used every year. Screech owls, I had a nice nesting screech owl here last year in a box that I put up. Most people are familiar with purple martins, another species that utilizes nest boxes. If you do find a nest and you want to photograph it, don't trim any leaves or branches. This leaves the nest more exposed to both the weather, sunlight, rain, and predation. And on that note of predation, so I like in this shot, you can tie the branch back temporarily while you take the shot and then let it go back to where it was, but don't keep going to that nest site. Things like cats and raccoons can smell where we've walked, and they can follow that scent trail. And if you're walking up to the nest, they'll follow that scent trail straight to the nest and eat the nestlings. So shelter and safety, one of the things to think about, and this has been a problem at my house, is birds flying into windows. So you don't want you either want your feeder right up against the window, so they're going to either be stopping or they're just going to be taking off. They won't have time to build up any speed, or you want it to be far enough out to where they're not going to be constantly coming in the near vicinity of your window. You still might occasionally have window strikes, but if you have a feeder that's only 8 or 10 feet away with a lot of activity, birds coming and going, you're really upping your chances of them flying into a window versus having it further away. You can watch them with binoculars. American Bird Conservancy estimates that about 1 billion birds die from bird strikes each year. So you can also do, put stickers on the windows. There is a UV dye that I just found out about. I wish I remembered the name of it, but you can Google that, UV dye for windows, that you can put some spots on your windows so the birds can see it. They realize that it's not open sky they're flying towards. Still sticking with friendly habitat. Think about cover where predators can sneak up on your birds. So you don't want bushes right up against a bird bath or a bird feeder, because that gives cover for predators to get right up on the birds and then pounce. But by the same token, you don't want it right out in the open with nothing anywhere close. The birds usually like to stage and they perch and look around before they drop down to your feeder. So you want something reasonably close, maybe 15 feet away or so, so that the birds will feel confident and stage before they drop down to your bird feeder. Speaking of predators, cats are always a big problem with any kind of small native wildlife. The American Bird Conservancy, actually this is Smithsonian, estimates that 3.7 billion birds are killed by cats every year. So if you have a house cat, please keep it indoors. Otherwise, make sure you've got your feeder and your bird bath set up to where the cats can't get too close before they rush out and pounce on the birds. Make sure that cover is not too close. Thinking about the health of our avian friends. Bird diseases, this was actually a pretty big problem this last winter. There was a salmonella outbreak that was going through birds most of the country, in particular around the Houston area and even around here. And all the birds are congregating at the feeders. It's kind of like us with COVID, right? You have a bunch of birds in one spot and they can pass this back and forth to each other, and can also get into the food, and then other birds come and eat the food. So think about that. You need to keep things clean. When there was the disease outbreak last year, we all had to take our feeders down so the birds would disperse, have that social distancing. They would be, on their own out in the wild and not congregating in one spot. When we have rainy weather, it's been cold and wet for a while, you can get mold and bacteria growing on your seed. So think about that. If we have a prolonged wet spell, you don't want moldy seeds, so clean that out. Let your feeder dry out. And also bacteria can thrive on bird droppings that accumulate around the feeders. So try to clean them out every couple of weeks. Same thing with bird baths. You don't want them to get too nasty. Let it dry out, clean it off, and then refill it with clean water. Hummingbird feeders in particular, clean once a week at the minimum. I don't fill mine all the way up in the summertime because the hummingbirds don't empty it. So I'll only put a little bit of feed mix in there, and it's a 4-to-1 ratio. You don't need to buy any mix. You don't need to add food coloring. 4 parts water to 1 part sugar for your hummingbirds, and just clean that out every 3 to 5 days, once a week at the max. Along about Labor Day, early September, we get a lot of hummingbirds, and then I'll start filling my hummingbird feeders to the top, and I don't have to worry about cleaning them weekly because they're going to be emptying it every couple of days. That's really fun, that early part of September. So storing bird seed, we store it in a metal container. I say a metal container because where I live, we had it in a plastic one, and the mice would chew through it, chew a hole into the container. So we had to put it in a metal one. You want to keep it dry. Again, if it gets wet, the seeds can start to sprout, or they can get moldy. And if you notice any larvae or webbing in there, your seed's probably not any good. You need to toss it and get some fresh. And if you're using hulled seeds, sunflowers and peanuts, Try to keep it cool. That's not easy to do here in Central Texas, but keeping it dry will help go a long way toward keeping it fresh. Okay, so we've talked about attracting birds to your yard, some bird habitat. Now let's talk about the actual photography, getting in there and getting some pleasing photos of our birds. The main thing we're going to be aiming for is a fast shutter speed and a large aperture. Talk about why. Why a fast shutter speed? Birds are always moving. They're rarely ever still. So the faster your shutter speed, the more you're going to be likely to freeze that action. A slow shutter speed is going to cause your images to be blurred as the bird is moving from side to side. You want a really fast shutter speed to stop that action. Birds are always twitchy and flighty and jumping around. Other things with bird photography, they've got a nictitating membrane, so like a third eyelid. And sometimes if you're only doing one shot, you might have that eyelid closed. So you're going to want to take a burst of 3 to 5 shots to make sure that you get a clear eye in at least one frame. Takeoffs and landings, you know, that fast action, you're going to want a fast shutter speed to capture that action. So why a large aperture? Well, for 2 reasons. Number one, it helps us get that fast shutter speed. So having a large, wide open aperture is going to allow the maximum amount of light in and let us use the shortest shutter speed we can for the light available. It also has the added advantage of making the background blur out. So a smaller aperture is going to make the background stand out more and not blur it out. And it's also going to cause a slower shutter speed. So I'm typically shooting wide open. My lenses are like f4 or 5.6, and then whatever the shutter speed is for the given light conditions. So if you're comfortable working in manual mode, that's probably your best option. Go ahead and set your aperture to the widest one that your lens will achieve, and then use the shutter speed to adjust your exposure. If you're not quite comfortable working in manual mode, or you're in a situation where the light is changing a lot, say you have part of it is in sun, part of it's in the shade, or you have clouds passing in front of the sun, and it's going from bright to cloudy, bright to cloudy, you might want to put it in what's called aperture priority. That's where you set the aperture, and then the camera will pick the shutter speed for you. And again, you're going to use your largest aperture that your lens will achieve, and then let the camera pick the shutter speed. Keeping an eye on the histogram and thinking about some things you might have to do to compensate. One thing that's really common with birds, okay, so this shot in particular, it's got a blue background. It's not too bad. Sometimes we run into where the sky is kind of white, and if you're pointing your camera at a bird against a white sky, your camera is going to tend to underexpose and make your bird come out black. So you'll have to use what's called exposure compensation to make your image brighter. Your sky is going to be blown out white, but you'll have a correct exposure on the bird. So this is the histogram. All digital cameras have a way to show this, and it's just a graphical representation of the tones in your image. You've got the darks on this side, the lights over here on the right, and that's the same with all histograms. There's no such thing as a perfect shape to the histogram. It just depends on what you're photographing. If you were photographing a snowshoe hare in snow and everything's white, all of the data is going to be over here in the highlights. You're not going to have any darks. You're photographing a black bear in a really dark forest. Everything might be over here in the shadows. You might not have any highlights. So it just depends on what it is you're photographing, what's in your scene, what the histogram looks like. But what we're looking for is we don't want it all piled up on one end or the other. We especially don't want it piled up over here. That's going to be solid black and you cannot recover it. If it's piled up a little bit on the highlight, that might be okay. That might mean that your sky is blown out. There's no detail there anyway. Depending on what you're photographing, if there's surf, you've got white surf splashing. Those splashes don't have detail in them. If they're blown out, that's fine. Doesn't matter. And this is just a couple of shots showing the different histograms. So here you can see this image is really dark. You can see everything's piled up here on the left in the shadows. As it gets lighter, you'll see it move over. It keeps popping up there. So you can see where there's a lot of space here. You've got a lot left on the table. You're not getting any data in those brights. You can see with this one, it's starting to move to the right. It's brighter. This is probably the best exposure. Everything is, it's kind of a little bit on the right, but it's not stacked up too bad. You have a little bit of a gap there. and the blacks are not blocked up. And then this one's overexposed. You can see it's too bright. You've got no detail in these bright areas, and you've got a big spike here in your histogram. Everything's piled up against the right side, and a big gap over here where you're not getting, your darks are not as dark as they should be. So that's just a representation of how to use your histogram and make sure you're getting a decent exposure. So additional tips, as the light starts to fade late in the evening, keep an eye on that shutter speed. When it gets down too low, 1/400th of a second, 1/250th of a second, go ahead and raise your ISO to get that shutter speed back up. Don't be afraid to raise your ISO if you need to. It's better to have a sharp bird with a little bit of digital noise than to have a blurry bird where it doesn't matter if it's noisy or not, it's not going to be useful. Like I said earlier, I always shoot in high-speed burst mode. I'm not taking just one shot. Anytime I'm pressing the shutter, I'm taking 3 to 5 frames, just because of that nictitating membrane, or the bird might flinch and make a motion, and you'll be able to capture that. So one of the things I really enjoy about backyard bird photography in particular is being able to set up and create my own little world. I'll use perches for the birds to sit on, and I'll go out and select perches that have some character. This is actually in Costa Rica, but it's the same idea. You want your perch to have some character, not just to be a boring dead stick or log. And we're going to attract our birds to that. So that's what they land on, and that's what we'll be photographing them on. You can get some nice wood with some nooks and crannies. This is here at my house with painted bunting. You can actually just barely see some white millet there. So I can put millet there in those nooks and crannies and attract the birds in. Depending on what you're photographing, you could put sunflower seeds or peanut butter in those nooks out of sight of the camera. So when the bird lands, you can get a photograph of it there, and it can eat, and you get all your shots while it's sitting there. You want to try to size your perches relative to the size of your bird. A great big log with this painted bunting landing on it would not be as attractive as a smaller, more slender stick. Then this one's got some nice lichen and ball moss growing on it to give me some interest. So like this one, that log is a little bit too big actually, but so you can spray it with water. It doesn't last for long when it's real hot. It dries up pretty quickly. But if you spray your wood down with water, it darkens it and it's more attractive in your image. So this shot was completely set up. I used a Christmas tree stand, put this log in it. You can just see right there, there's the edge of a hole I drilled a hole in it, filled it with sunflower seeds, draped the vine with the berries over it, and placed it in these wildflowers here. Boom, I've got my image. So you can really get creative with decorating up your perch, berries, flowers, lichen, whatever you want to do to really add some interest to your shots. And the bird shows up. It's a wild and free bird, but you've got kind of a controlled situation. You can get some really attractive photos that way. This is actually the top of that same log. Again, I used a Christmas tree stand and a drill bit to make a hole in it, added some food, some decoration, and then the green jay here in South Texas came to investigate what was going on with that sunflower seed. This was a perch that I set up near a feeder, hoping the birds would land on it before they went to the feeder. Did not expect, it was a complete awesome bonus that this golden fronted woodpecker actually picked one of the berries from my perch. I just used the perch because it was attractive. I didn't really think they were going to eat the berries off of it. But that's really was a bonus. So by placing our perches, we can put them wherever we want and control our background. And usually if you have something near a feeder, the birds will land on that first, look around, and then jump to the feeder. So we can kind of control our placement. Again, same thing as with that last photo with the woodpecker. I picked this perch because it was attractive, and I was a bonus. The cardinal actually picked one of those agarita berries and bit into it. So birds often will land in what I call stage before they go to the feeder. So I use that to my advantage. Place an attractive perch close to the feeder, wait for the bird to land on it, and get the shot before they go on over and start feeding from the actual feeder. If you have a perch with leaves on it, you can trim the leaves off of a certain spot, and you can pretty much know that that's where the birds are going to land, where they're going to be. They like that little clear area, and that way you can be focused there, be ready, get the shot as soon as the bird lands. And this is pretty much the same thing. This got ball moss up here, lichen down here, this clear spot. Pretty much know that's where the birds are going to land. I had a feeder right over here, just out of the frame. Titmouse lands on it, get my shot, and then he jumps down to the feeder. So if you've got a lot of birds, that's a good problem to have. If you're using a tray feeder, you can cover that up and just leave a spot big enough for one bird at a time. And then the other birds are going to be hanging out, hopefully on the branches that you set up, or maybe some natural perches, waiting for that spot to vacate, and then they'll fly down. And that gives us really a lot of photo opportunities when there's a lot of birds. Hummingbird feeders, again, you can, if you have a feeder with multiple holes, you can tape them all closed except for one. Then you know the hummingbird's going to be coming to that one hole. And hummingbirds often will feed from a feeder for a few seconds, and then they'll back up and hover in place. Then they'll come back and feed again. So if you don't want the feeder in your shot, you can focus on the bird, and then when it backs up, that's when you take your shot. So you can imagine that there's a feeder just out of sight of this image right here. The hummingbird backs up, you get your shot, then he comes back and feeds some more. Background is super important, and by using perches and setups and feeders, we can really control this. The further away your background is, the more it's going to smooth out to this nice blur. A busy background can really kill your image. This is one of my early shots when I was first starting out. I'm just looking at the beautiful iridescence on this wild turkey's plumage. I didn't even think about what a horrible mess of a background that is. Pretty much killed the shot. This one, it's kind of somewhere in between. It's not too bad. In fact, if it wasn't for this white stick over here, I would actually really like this background. It shows the bird's environment, the habitat that it lives in, without being too busy or distracting. And then you've got what I usually strive for, a nice smooth background with no distractions. So you're looking at the bird is your subject. You don't want to be distracted by bright spots or busyness in your background. And again, the easiest way to achieve that is just to have your background really far away. So if your setup is 15 feet away from you, you're sitting there with your camera, you've got your feeder and your perch 15 feet away, but you want anything in the background to be at least 15 feet further behind that, preferably even more, 20, 25, 30. The further away your background is behind your subject, the more the background's going to blur out to that nice smooth color. You can also change your background just by changing position. I was leading a photo walk down on the coast a few years ago and saw this gull perched on a piling, and realized that just, my first shot was this one with the yellow background. Take a step to the right, I have a pink background. Take 2 steps to the left, and I have a blue background. So by changing your position, you change the perspective, and you can change the background of your image. These were different colored houses there along the marina. So getting close to the end here, talking about where you're going to be relative to the birds. Depending on the birds, you can just be right out in the open. Hummingbirds are typically really not afraid of people. You don't have to be concealed. You can pretty much stand or sit out in the open, and they're not going to be too concerned. If you have birds that come and go while you're out working in the yard, again, they're not going to be too concerned. You can just pull up a lawn chair and photograph to your heart's content. Some birds are a little more shy. You might need a blind. You can either use like a pop-up hunting blind, which can be really hot if they're in the sun. Or I build my own blinds here at the house with PVC pipe and shade cloth, so they're not as hot. They could be concealed, so some of the shyer birds will go ahead and come in and not be afraid. Sometimes, depending on your situation, you might even be able to just shoot from the house. If you've got a window you can open, take the screen out, and just shoot from inside the house, and the house will act as your blind. If you have a small backyard, you might be thinking, well, I can't do all these things. Well, maybe you can. You might have to use an artificial background. You can use a sheet or a printed background, something to put behind your setup. because you don't have enough distance to get the nice smooth background that we're trying to achieve. And just use a simple feeder and a setup. There's many birds that'll come even to an apartment balcony if you've got a feeder set up. So wrapping it up, taking the shot, putting it all together. One of the things to think about is light. You've got quality of light and direction of light in photography. As far as quality of light, it's usually the first and last hour of the day. They call it magic hour. In reality, it's really only about 20 minutes where it's really, really good. But that light right after sunset, right before sunset, right after sunrise, is the best light of the day. It's low in the sky, it's directional, it has that nice golden quality to it. And that's really the best time to be doing any kind of outdoor photography. Overcast, light shade can work really well too, as long as it's not too dark. You eliminate the shadows, we're able to pick up all the little details in the bird's plumage. And that can really be pleasing light to work with bird photography. What we don't want is midday light when it's nice and bright and sunny. We're going to have really harsh highlights on the sunlit part, really dark shadows in the part that's in the shade, and generally is not too pleasing for photography. I typically will not take any photos in midday light when it's nice and sunny. Now, as far as direction of light, for bird photography, typically we like what's called front light. That is where the light is coming from behind you and shining directly onto your subject. The easiest way to think about this is to point your shadow to the bird. If your shadow is pointing towards your subject, you've got front light. And for bird photography, that is generally going to give you the most attractive and pleasing results. You can do side light. Generally for birds, it's not that attractive. This particular shot is kind of semi-side light. I didn't really keep any that I've ever taken with birds because either I didn't take it in the first place or I deleted them. But with side light, you're going to have one side in sun and one side in shadow. Doesn't work so good, in my opinion, for birds. It does work well for landscapes. It gives you that nice texture for mountains, sand dunes, things like that. That's where you want to use your side light. And finally, backlight. That's where the light is shining directly towards you. So your subject is often going to be a silhouette. Other uses for backlight, I've seen egrets in breeding plumage with that nice feathery plumage with the light coming through it. That can be really attractive as well. Can be kind of tricky to get it right if you're doing something other than a silhouette. Silhouettes are pretty easy. Other types of backlight can be tricky, but can give you some really dramatic results if you can pull it off. Composition wise, try to avoid this. You don't want a small subject dead center in the middle of your image with nothing really around it to give any interest. It's kind of a boring photo. You would be better off either having the bird off to the side or just cropping this to where it's out of the center. And that brings us to the rule of thirds. Of course, you don't want every shot to look like this, but one of the basic composition rules, split your frame up into thirds vertically and horizontally, and then place your subject on those lines. Even better is where those lines cross. It's called a PowerPoint. So you can get your subject on one of those spots if it's taking up less than half the frame. Generally makes for a pretty good composition. So you can see that crane is pretty much on one of the thirds line with his eye near one of the PowerPoints. With birds, wildlife, people, you want to have your subject looking into or moving into the frame. I wouldn't want this painted bunting over here looking out of the frame. It's just awkward. So you want to give it some space to look and to move into your image. Action is always good. A portrait is really nice, but if you can get the birds doing something, it's always going to give you a more exciting shot. Have some action. That's where our fast shutter speed is going to come in. This is two results here, one from the fast shutter speed, one from taking a burst. So I was photographing this indigo bunting. It just landed on this stem. And when I took my shot, I took like a 3-shot burst. The second frame, it heard the sound of the shutter and it took off. Let me get this image. In this place in the top 100, I don't remember which year it was, but in the Audubon annual contest for bird photography. So wrapping it up with backyard bird photography, You're creating your own little world with the setups and the feeders. You can place them wherever you want. Get the light coming from the direction you want. Go out at the time you want for the quality of light that you want to use. Basically, you're creating your own world so that you can get the sort of images that you really want. And that brings us to the end. If you have any questions, Jill said at the beginning, my website is exploreandfocus.com. I offer photography workshops here at my place and do tours to various locations in the US and abroad. That's all I've got, Jill.
Okay, fantastic. I am trying to figure out how to bring my view up. I'm new to the technology. I apologize. Okay, I've got let's here, start video. Okay, I think we're good. So thank you, Jeff. That was wonderful. And I was looking at my image and I've got some backlight and I'm like at the side of I'm not looking at you. So that my camera's in a weird position. Anyway, it didn't quite work out for me to set this up the way, this is what not to do, right? We have a good example of that. So, but thank you so much. That was amazing. So many beautiful photos. Oh my gosh, that was just astounding. And such good advice too. Know your birds, keep a journal, do your research. Yeah, thanks
sure.
for all those tips. How to track the birds, how to keep them around, how to keep them safe. I mean, that was really fantastic. And of course, all the technical details on the photographic equipment and planting native plants and keeping insects around. I don't think a lot of people, think about that, but that is so important, reducing pesticides so that the birds can eat. I mean,
right.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you.
This year's been really good with all the rain we've had this summer. We've got tons of butterflies this year. I'm really loving it.
That's fantastic. Very good. Very good. So if any of our viewers are interested in birding or trying to take photos of the birds, more information about this topic and Jeff's contact information, well, we've got the information for you on the Chamber's website. And thanks again for watching this Eco Photo Fest presentations. And thanks to all our sponsors. I have to share the screen just for a second. I have to share the screen to get my sponsors up. And so here's all of our sponsors. We've got our title sponsors is WJC Constructors, and then all these other sponsors. Here for more information, here's our Facebook page. And if you did want to be a sponsor, at least maybe for next year, there's some information here about that as well. Thanks again to all of our sponsors. Thank you, Jeff, for all of the work that you've done and for coming here today and talking with us. And please, everybody, join us for the live interactive Zoom sessions this week. We've got 6 p.m. on Tuesday, August 31st, and 6 p.m. on Thursday, September 2nd. You can ask Jeff and the other panelists your questions about eco and the photo sessions you've seen, and we hope to see you there. And Jeff, I think you're planning on being there on September 2nd. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to say thanks again. And very good. I'm going to stop recording, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Jill.
Oh, I forgot to stop recording. Hold on.